it goes beyond chip nationalism. So chip nationalism, for me, is the effort of governments to kind of bring back, to reshore parts of the value chain. So if we look at efforts, for example, within China, within the US, within Europe, to substantially invest in the domestic semiconductor ecosystem and industry, this for me is part of chip nationalism. So if you heavily invest in your own companies, if you create incentives for foreign companies to, for example, manufacture chips in your own region, this is all part of chip nationalism. Exploiting choke points goes in the other direction. Exploiting choke points is about denying foreign companies access to your own technology. For example, export restrictions would be one example of exploiting choke points. In certain areas where the market relied on large players and the necessary market concentration to be efficient, to use economies of scale, in these areas such as chips manufacturing, in this area, if companies start to diversify by geography, so for example, TSMC opening up a fabrication plant in the United States, and also previously several manufacturers opening up fabs in mainland China, then to some extent this creates inefficiencies, because typically these companies produce the most efficiently and the cheapest in their home country, because there they have the R&D ecosystem, they have their supplier network, and rebuilding all of that in a different region creates naturally inefficiencies. At the same time, I think for the industry as a whole, it's also a good thing, even though it creates inefficiencies, it also creates diversity. So a more diverse value chain is more resilient, for example, against natural disasters such as a tsunami or an earthquake. If industry and society rely increasingly on semiconductors, I think the value chain needs to be more diversified. In that regard, for manufacturing, it's a good thing that we see more and more regions trying to have their own capacity. In other areas such as chip design, naturally, we already see a diversification. So there, we don't really need governments to intervene. Increasingly, companies that previously had nothing to do with semiconductors, since a couple of years, design their own chips. So if we think of Google or Alibaba or Tesla now all designing their own chips, I think that's a good thing, because it creates, again, ultimately more efficient, more application-specific semiconductors for a particular industry or for a particular company even. If you think of TSMC, you have to understand that for the most advanced chips, 7 nanometer or 5 nanometer chips manufacturing, there is really no alternative to either TSMC or Samsung. There is simply nobody else who can produce such advanced chips. And then US American chip designers, NVIDIA, Tesla, Xilinx, Broadcom, all those rely on TSMC's manufacturing capabilities, and to some extent also on Samsung's. But the difference between Samsung and TSMC is that TSMC is just a contract chip manufacturer. They don't have their own product line or business case. They are really just focused on manufacturing, and because of that, you can perceive them as neutral, so to speak. While Samsung produces their own mobile chips, they have their own memory chips. So especially in the beginning of Samsung's foundry business, or contract chip manufacturing, the problem was that a competitor wouldn't necessarily order chips from Samsung. They wouldn't necessarily rely on Samsung's foundry business to produce chips, because you wouldn't really rely on your competitor to produce your own chips, right? So that's why, in terms of reputation, in terms of business relationships, trust relationship, and also maturity of the overall manufacturing process, TSMC is really number one, and that's why they have consistently a 50 to 60% overall market share. So in that regard, it is really hard to think of an advanced semiconductor company that does not rely on TSMC's manufacturing capabilities. TSMC's client network or customer base really spreads all around the world, and that's why if you take them out of the equation, if TSMC's manufacturing capabilities would be disrupted, that would have tremendous immediate effects on the entire industry.